A mountain of broken flowers lay rotting beneath the blazing afternoon sun, filling the air with a sweet scent that had turned into the smell of waste. Every single day, truck after truck unloaded fresh-cut roses, peonies, tulips, and dahlias that had been rejected for tiny imperfections. They weren't diseased. They weren't dead. They simply weren't perfect enough to sell. While thousands of beautiful blooms were thrown away without a second glance, one poor black boy stood silently beside the growing piles, seeing something no one else could. Before we begin, if you believe kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change lives, please like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel to become part of our growing community. 14-year-old Carson Hale had learned early that life rarely handed second chances to people like him. He lived with his grandmother, Mabel, in a tiny weathered farmhouse just outside the small farming town of Ashton Ridge. Since his mother had passed away after a long illness and his father had disappeared years before, Mabel had become everything to him. She worked long hours sewing clothes for neighbors while Carson spent every afternoon helping wherever he could to keep food on the table. One of his odd jobs involved sweeping loading docks at Bloomcrest Farms, one of the largest flower growers in the county. The farm supplied expensive florists, luxury hotels, weddings, and high-end boutiques across the country. Every bloom had to be flawless. If a petal curled the wrong direction, if the stem leaned slightly, if one blossom opened too early, the flower was tossed aside. Carson couldn't understand it. As he swept the loading yard each afternoon beneath bright blue skies, he watched workers dumping wagon after wagon of flowers into enormous compost heaps. The colors looked like rainbows melting into the earth. One afternoon he quietly asked an older groundskeeper named Walter why they threw away so many flowers. Walter sighed heavily. He explained that customers paid for perfection. Anything less became waste. That was simply business. Those words stayed with Carson during the long walk home. Waste. The flowers still smelled wonderful. They still looked beautiful. Most people would have proudly displayed them on their own tables. Yet every day, tons disappeared into piles that slowly turned brown beneath the sun. The next afternoon Carson asked permission to take a few damaged flowers home instead of watching them rot. The supervisor laughed and shrugged. They were garbage anyway. Soon Carson carried home armfuls of blossoms every afternoon. Mabel placed them in old jars around their tiny home. Their kitchen suddenly glowed with vibrant colors despite cracked walls and worn furniture. Neighbors began stopping by simply to admire the arrangements. One elderly widow smiled with tears in her eyes after receiving a small bouquet Carson had tied together with leftover ribbon. She confessed she hadn't received flowers since her husband died 12 years earlier. That moment changed everything. Carson realized the flowers had never lost their beauty. Only their price. Every afternoon he sorted through discarded blooms beneath the warm sunshine. He noticed that while individual flowers carried tiny flaws, combining them together created stunning arrangements where imperfections disappeared into the overall beauty. His grandmother watched him experiment on their old kitchen table. Without expensive tools or formal training, Carson naturally understood color balance, texture, and movement. Instead of hiding damaged petals, he built arrangements that celebrated uniqueness. Bent stems created graceful curves. Uneven blossoms added character. Slightly faded petals blended softly beside brighter colors. Nothing looked discarded anymore. Everything looked intentional. Mabel quietly smiled. She believed some people were born with gifts that couldn't be taught. Weeks later Carson borrowed an old bicycle and visited local nursing homes during the daytime, offering free bouquets made entirely from discarded flowers. Residents cried. Nurses hugged him. Staff members began asking whether they could buy extra arrangements for visitors. Carson refused payment at first. Then Mabel gently reminded him that accepting honest work wasn't greed. It was dignity. Soon Carson charged $5 for larger bouquets. Every dollar helped pay grocery bills. Word spread across Ashton Ridge. Teachers ordered classroom flowers. The town library decorated reading tables with his arrangements. A small cafe displayed fresh bouquets every morning. Customers constantly asked where the owner found such unusual designs. One afternoon a woman named Lorraine visited the cafe. She owned a small wedding planning business. She studied Carson's arrangement carefully. Instead of perfectly matching flowers, the bouquet looked alive. Every bloom seemed to tell its own story. She found Carson working outside Bloomcrest Farms. After hearing where the flowers came from, she stared in disbelief. Garbage? These were made from garbage? She immediately ordered 20 wedding centerpieces. Carson nearly dropped his basket. He had never received an order that large. For the next several sunny days, Mabel, Walter, and a few neighbors volunteered to help. The wedding guests couldn't stop talking about the flowers. Photographs spread across social media. Comments poured in asking who designed such breathtaking arrangements. Soon another planner called. Then another. Boutique stores requested displays. Photographers wanted floral installations. Carson suddenly faced more work than he could handle. Meanwhile, Bloomcrest Farms noticed something strange. Their compost piles were shrinking. Not because less was being rejected. Because Carson was taking more away each day. The farm's owner, Graham Whitmore, finally decided to investigate. Whitmore had built Bloomcrest into a multi-million-dollar business over 3 decades. He believed efficiency mattered more than sentiment. When he visited Carson's small workshop behind Mabel's farmhouse, he expected childish crafts. Instead, he found professional floral art unlike anything he had ever seen. Designers from nearby cities wandered through the yard examining arrangements with amazement. Some were openly bidding against each other. One designer offered $300 for a single oversized installation. Another placed an order for 15 corporate events. Whitmore stood speechless. These people weren't asking for perfect flowers. They were begging for imperfect ones. His entire business model suddenly looked upside down. Still, pride clouded his judgment. He offered Carson a small contract allowing him to collect leftovers for a modest monthly fee. Carson politely declined. The answer surprised everyone. He explained that paying for garbage made no sense. Those flowers were destined for compost. If the farm truly wanted to reduce waste, they should become partners instead of landlord and customer. Whitmore wasn't accustomed to hearing a teenager negotiate with confidence. He walked away irritated. Several weeks later, disaster struck Bloomcrest. News reports criticized agricultural waste after photographs of massive flower dumps spread online. Environmental groups questioned why perfectly usable flowers were being discarded. Large corporate buyers became concerned about sustainability. Orders slowed. Whitmore realized public perception had become a financial problem. Then reporters discovered Carson. Instead of criticizing the farm, Carson spoke with kindness. He never blamed Bloomcrest. He explained that businesses often followed traditions without realizing better solutions existed. He thanked the farm for allowing him access to discarded flowers. His grace surprised everyone. Whitmore expected public attacks. Instead, Carson offered respect. That generosity touched him more deeply than criticism ever could. For the first time in years, Whitmore admitted he had been wrong. He invited Carson to help redesign Bloomcrest's waste program. Together they created a second collection line. Rejected flowers no longer headed directly toward compost. Instead, they entered a new division dedicated to artistic floral design. Carson trained workers to sort blooms differently. Design students visited the farm for workshops. Local charities received free flowers every week. Hospitals welcomed bright arrangements that lifted patients' spirits. Retirement communities overflowed with color. Schools hosted floral art competitions using imperfect blossoms. Waste dropped dramatically. Something unexpected happened next. Luxury designers began requesting the imperfect collection specifically. They explained that flawless bouquets looked manufactured. Carson's natural arrangements felt emotional, authentic, and alive. Suddenly Bloomcrest earned more money selling creatively imperfect flowers than they had ever earned throwing them away. National magazines featured Carson's remarkable journey. Articles described how one observant teenager had transformed agricultural waste into a movement celebrating beauty beyond perfection. Yet Carson never forgot the lonely widow who had first smiled after receiving one simple bouquet. Whenever interviews asked about his greatest achievement, he always answered the same way. Success wasn't measured by magazine covers or business contracts. Success was seeing someone remember they mattered. Months later Bloomcrest held its annual community celebration under bright afternoon sunshine. Families wandered through endless flower fields while children laughed between colorful rows. At the center of the event stood a giant sculpture built entirely from rescued flowers. Thousands of slightly imperfect blossoms formed a magnificent heart stretching high above the crowd. Whitmore stepped onto the stage with Carson beside him. His voice trembled as he admitted that for years he had mistaken perfection for value. A tiny flaw had blinded him to extraordinary beauty. The crowd applauded, not because a wealthy businessman had confessed a mistake, but because he had chosen humility instead of pride. Walter wiped tears from his eyes. Mabel squeezed Carson's hand. She remembered the quiet boy who once carried discarded flowers home in old buckets because he simply couldn't bear watching beauty thrown away. Now those same flowers had transformed an entire industry. Carson later walked through the fields one final time that afternoon, surrounded by rows of blooms dancing gently beneath the sunlight. He understood something that reached far beyond flowers. People often judged one another the same way. One mistake. One scar. One difficult season. One imperfect chapter. Too often, society decided someone had lost their worth. But hidden inside every person remained beauty waiting for someone willing to see it. Before this story comes to an end, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been overlooked or made to feel imperfect, only to discover your unique qualities became your greatest strength? Leave a meaningful comment below and inspire someone else who may need hope today. As Carson and Mabel returned to their little farmhouse, fresh bouquets filled every room, not because they had become wealthy, but because they had learned that abundance begins with gratitude. The same flowers once destined for decay now celebrated weddings, comforted grieving families, brightened hospital rooms, decorated community gatherings, and reminded countless people that imperfections could become masterpieces in the right hands. Bloomcrest Farms no longer measured success by how many flawless blooms they sold, but by how little beauty they allowed to go to waste. And every afternoon, under the warm daylight that had witnessed the beginning of Carson's journey, fields once known for their mountains of discarded flowers became a symbol of compassion, creativity, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come from finding something perfect. They come from finally seeing the priceless beauty that was there all along.